This is Duke University.
So I'd just like to welcome everyone. Thank you everyone for coming. This is an entirely student-curated exhibit, curated exclusively out of the David Rubenstein library, this Rare Books and Special Collections library of Duke. And it was an exhibit that was cultivated by the students over a long period of time, that germinated in a variety of different ways with interest in problems of empire and cartography, and also in dialogue with a simultaneous exhibit of Lines of Control, which is an exhibit, if you haven't seen it yet, which is fabulous, on contemporary artists and modern artists responding to the problems and conditions of modern and postmodern partition and post-colonial partition. So the students here curated these maps to look at the ways in which colonialism, in many ways, divided up the world so that you can have the post-colonial lines of partition that are dealt with in Lines of Control.
Yeah. So I'm Beth. I was just going to give you a quick chat about how the structure of the lab kind of works. So a humanities lab at Duke is basically bringing together students, faculty, grad and undergrad to engage in really advanced research. It started out actually with a group of students who were from a lot of different backgrounds who were interested in doing British Empire kind of research. We weren't really sure what we wanted to do with it. We knew that we had the option, but we could pretty much do whatever we want as long as it came out of Rubenstein. So I actually ended up writing a grant with one other student to follow Professor Stern and Professor Ramaswamy to Cornell over spring break, it was a lovely place over spring break, to see Lines of Control where it was first organized. Ever since, this is where we are. So, and then I'm going to pass it to Jordan. Jordan is a Trinity senior, and she worked on some of our Latin American maps. So she's going to talk to you about that.
You know, artistic aspects are just as important to understanding a map as sort of the scientific cartographic aspects are. And so, for example, in this, you've got color, which, you know, a lot of times you'll have oceans are blue. It's just sort of something you connect instantaneously, so the viewer's going to be like, okay, that's water. And then you've got these lines of red that are defining the mountain chains. So all these colors sort of help highlight different features and just throw them out at the viewer maybe quicker than something that wouldn't have had this color. There are two ships here. Can be very helpful as well. A lot of times they'll have flags on them, so you can, you know, be like, oh, okay, so the ship is coming from Spain or Portugal. So that's a really easy visual cue to help you understand who is kind of conquering or exploring the areas that are depicted. While a lot of these scientific aspects, like your scale, your title, your orientation, are really important in understanding a map, the artistic expressions are equally as valuable to analyzing what can be going on there.
Right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the authorship of maps. One of the first things we looked for when we chose these maps is evidently who created them. And at first it seemed like this would be fairly simple, kind of like a book. You have the author behind the map, they made it, and they found a publisher, and the publisher released it. Pretty quickly, we discovered that this was not the case at all. Mapped authorship is much more complicated. You have the explorers, visitors to foreign climes who often made surveys or took notes or knew the land. But these were very rarely the people who actually created the maps. Sometimes they would send notes back to England or France.
Other times they would carry back personal stories, but the people who actually drew the maps usually had never been to the places and had only these first-hand accounts, sometimes second or third or even fourth-hand accounts of the places to create the maps. Knowing who made the map helps a lot, first of all, because you know which nation it was coming from, who the map maker might have identified with, what there might be motivations or theories, or the principle and purpose behind creating this map. Was it supposed to shore up an imperial image? Was it supposed to just educate scholars in the nation? And evidently this is a lot easier when you have a well-known map maker who is known for doing certain types of work. You know that maybe he was cartographer to the king in England. That's fantastic. You know that he has a well-known audience who's reading his maps. But some of these lesser-known map makers, it's a little more difficult to understand why exactly they created the map, who would have been reading the map, and what purpose it served. And use that to kind of see where they lay in the overall kind of history of maps and how they contributed to empire.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research process and why we decided to choose this particular map, which, you know, the reason first and foremost is that it's an exact replica, aside from German nomenclature, of James Rennell, who is a very famous map maker from England, and he was actually the first surveyor general of the East India Trading Company, who had a lot of influence and a lot of interest in this area for colonial purposes. And he actually gives credit to James Rennell writing the cartouche, so that was pretty easy to figure out after translating Google Translate what it said. You know, our exhibition is about colonialism and about empire, and whether or not he meant to do so by recreating this map and everything on it that James Rennell deemed purposeful for the East India Trading Company, Franz Anton Tramble was furthering that and furthering it for the Austrian public. Whatever intentions Mr. Rennell had and whatever biases came off in his map of India were also perpetuated by Franz Anton Tramble in his Austrian atlas.
So I'm actually going to talk about my research project with a map that's over there by the main wall text, but I'm not talking about the civics, so please stay over here. Yeah. I had a really interesting research process with this map. I picked the map and I started researching it, and I initially didn't find that much of the information that I wanted. You know, I met with the went through journal articles, books, and I just couldn't find the information that I wanted. I couldn't really find much about John Bartholomew, who's a map maker's mapping of Africa. I didn't know what date, I wasn't sure of the date that it was published, and I didn't know what publication it was part of. So I think actually after we had to submit our draft of our first draft for the labels, I found this resource, the Bartholomew Archive, which is part of the National Library of Scotland. All I had to give them was pretty much a picture of the map and basically that John Bartholomew had done it. And I also didn't really know if they would email me back, but they did. I got an email back both from the curator of the archive and a PhD student focusing on map making, Bartholomew's map making of Africa, and they told me, you know, who they produced these maps for, that the map was specifically made on September 16th, 1878, that it cost 37 pounds, 13 shillings, 6 pence to produce this map. This process really taught me that research is not just about, you know, journal articles, books, the library. It's also about making connections with people, talking to people to get information, and that you can really find research in unexpected places.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about what Lauren touched upon, which were armchair cartographers. And these are map makers who made maps of places they never actually visited themselves, using travel accounts, books written by people who had actually been to these places. So quite an impressive feat when you think about it. And it led to some very surprisingly accurate maps and some very inaccurate ones. This map is of India in ancient times. D'Anville, the cartographer who made it, was the cartographer to the French king, and so he made a good deal or a decent amount of money making maps on commission. But this map he made out of pocket. And so he published an entire book about why he made this map and the sources that he used from antiquity to make it with. And he likely paid for this out of his own pocket because he cared so much about it.
In addition, you also have to think about whose representation of that space it is. Not only who made the map, which was made by a German cartographer, but also it was made by a German cartographer using information from a variety of sources, including English explorers, British explorers, American cartographical societies. They used some Italian official maps of North Africa. It came from a wide variety of sources, so those are represented in this map. It was made in celebration of German colonialism for the 1885 Berlin Convention, and so in that way it not only represents German imperialism, but also just a wider European imperialism in general.
To say just how much from scratch all of this came. Students were culled through thousands, I would imagine, maps, a variety of forms, in different forms, wall maps, atlases, a number of new acquisitions, a number of things that have been in Perkins and Rubenstein Library for years, to figure out what the right maps, both aesthetically and intellectually, were to tell the story of European colonialism, starting with Ortelius and this sort of first contact with the New World, through to the Berlin West Africa Conference, which is phenomenally critiqued by Inka Shonobari's piece, which is just around the other side of this wall. So a really phenomenal achievement in starting from scratch with very little to go on. I mean, students are used to, in doing this research, looking at things with lots of words and lots of clues. And instead what you have with a map is essentially a visual text that doesn't give you as many clues, and as some of the talks mentioned, gives you a lot of misleading clues, that there's a cartographer with a name on there that belies an entire set of social relations and economic relations. A notion of empire that is not just produced by states or by imperial powers, but for markets and for a variety of different purposes. The ways in which the students embraced enthusiastically, energetically, and with no small amount of stress, doing something that wasn't just research for a class where you just turn in a paper and it stays in a dialogue within the class, but rather something for public consumption, something where they could tell the story and show and learn through the process of research in remarkable dynamic ways. I think they've done an amazing job here, and I just would like to sort of give them a round of applause.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.